She admitted she was still digging into one and kept the case open, raising the team's urgency. Lieutenant Jung Saman paused over the dossier and whispered about CEO Jung's clearance. A colleague asked why she kept digging into one and watched her leave. She refused to stop and told the colleague it was her choice. Alone, she replayed images of men cars and the one logo and frowned. Memories of Yu Bam and other targets surfaced and deepened her suspicion. She concluded CEO Jung had not been fully cleared and kept the case open. The team felt the urgency rise as she promised to find something. Lieutenant Jung Saman reviewed the dossier and refused to let the one inquiry close. She replayed images of men, cars, and the one logo as her suspicion deepened. Elsewhere, Yu Bam waited in a doorway when a senior announced there was a spy. The speaker named a mole among the 3 team leaders and then ordered Yu Bam to find the spy and kill them. Yu Bam realized catching the mole would fast-track him to a team leader position and noted the opportunity had arrived sooner than expected. Yu Bam personally pledged to catch the spy and win Chairman Jung's trust quickly. He stepped into a narrow corridor and then heard someone call his name. A man stepped forward and asked if he was Yu Bam and explained his role. Stephen arrived and announced he would follow Yu Bam for the time being. Yu Bam accepted the introduction and noted the career opportunity that now opened. A sudden flash showed Stephen bloodied and scarred, which implied a violent history. Yu Bam registered the implication and prepared to exploit the opening at once. Yu Bam had pledged to catch the spy and win Chairman Jung's trust quickly. He stepped into a narrow corridor where men assembled and called his name. A man confirmed Yu Bam's identity and explained his role. Stephen arrived and said he would follow Yu Bam for now. Yu Bam accepted and noted the career opening. The team moved toward waiting cars. Stephen declined a methodical approach and proposed direct action. He promised to handle the targets like gangsters and to rough them up the old-fashioned way. Yu Bam registered the violent implication and prepared to exploit the opening. Yu Bam had vowed to catch the spy and secure Chairman Jung's trust quickly. He moved into a private lounge where men laughed and expensive bottles sat on tables. Stephen sat composed and uncorked an aged bottle while prompting the mood toward celebration. He urged Yu Bam to drink, though Yu Bam kept his silence and declined. Yu Bam registered the implication and suspected they planned to render him immobile. A subordinate announced the customer's arrival, and Stephen directed Yu Bam to approach inside. Yu Bam had vowed to catch the spy and secure Chairman Jung's trust quickly. He moved through a private lounge where men laughed and bottles sat on tables. Stephen uncorked an aged bottle and pushed a celebratory mood while urging Yu Bam to drink. Yu Bam refused and watched for a sedative. A subordinate announced a guest, and Stephen ordered Yu Bam to get dressed and get to business. Yu Bam bristled but complied. He opened a shabby door and faced a young man who introduced himself as Bitmain's vice chairman Baek-hoon, the chairman's son. Yu Bam moved through the private lounge toward a group gathered on a red sofa. He paused when he faced Baek-hoon, the vice chairman introduced earlier. Yu Bam reminded them he had warned about the chairman of coin currency. A pink-haired man laughed and promised they would do things the old-fashioned way. The men erupted in loud laughter and traded mocking lines about their amazing coin. One man asked whether the certificate of commendation would go to the vice chairman. Yu Bam watched them silently, calculating his next move under their amusement. Yu Bam observed as a young man scrolled a laptop and promised to try next week. The man said he could convince his father. A suited attendee laughed and urged him to use old-fashioned ways. They traded jokes while Yu Bam cataloged faces and small motions. His mind listed exchanged information and noted how power rested with the family patriarch. A framed portrait served as proof of that power. Yu Bam traced the chain back and wondered if those small ants caused everything. He felt a chill and watched one man rise to go to the toilet. A small ornamental crown struck the back of a man's head and landed askew. In the private room, a man lounged on velvet and called out to a nervous guest. He urged the guest to relieve himself there and dangled a certificate of commendation. Others laughed and labeled him vice chairman, while a protesting voice tried to object. The man grinned and confessed plainly that he liked men and enjoyed the jest. Yu Bayam watched from the periphery and catalogued how status bent consent inside that room. A small ornamental crown had fallen onto a man's head and landed askew. In the private room, the lounger taunted a nervous guest and dangled a certificate. Others laughed and labeled him vice chairman, while a protesting voice tried to object. A waiter entered and placed plates before the lounger. The lounger denied ordering the food, and the man labeled vice chairman said it would be billed. The guest exploded in rage, kicked the waiter, and hurled insults. The waiter stumbled backward and gasped. Yu Bayam watched from the periphery and catalogued how status bent consent. The club guest lunged and struck the other man without restraint. Blows landed across a tiled floor while a waiter stood nearby. The wounded man collapsed and clutched his side, knocking plates to the floor. Sauce and dishes scattered across tiles. Onlookers laughed and mocked him for eating everything. One man joked about the bill and the meal's expense. The wounded man gagged and tried to retch while the attackers jeered. Yu Bayam watched from the periphery and catalogued how status forced submission. The wounded man gagged and doubled over on the tiled floor. A club guest stepped forward and sneered at him. The guest scolded the man for puking and labeled him weak. He proclaimed poverty a mental illness and taunted survival as inferiority. He boasted that hardship made him vice chairman at 25. Plates and sauce lay scattered around the victim's hands. The room's laughter underscored the assault's cruelty. Yu Bayam lingered at the periphery and catalogued how rank and mockery enforced obedience. The wounded man lay doubled over among scattered plates and sauce as the club guest jeered and labeled him weak. The guest announced it was punching time and bragged about his energy while the victim begged for mercy. A suited attendant shut the door and the guest moved in. He struck the man with a sandal and drew blood, then mocked him further and declared he would use him as a punching bag for the night. Yu Bayam watched from the edge and noted how rank and ridicule enforced obedience. The club guest stepped closer and asked Stephen if he could use the wounded man as a punching bag. Stephen replied with a guarded yes, and the guest's expression hardened. He announced they would start and then moved toward the injured man on the floor. A suited attendant closed the door and laughter rose among the onlookers. Yu Bayam stayed at the edge, watching how dominance was enforced through violence. The wounded man begged while his pleas were met with jeers and the threat of further blows. The club guest stepped forward and asked Stephen for permission to strike the wounded man. Stephen gave a guarded yes, and the guest's expression hardened immediately. He announced they would start and moved toward the injured man on the floor. A suited attendant shut the door and laughter rose among the onlookers. Yu Bayam stayed at the edge, watching how dominance was enforced through violence. The guest taunted the wounded man, then unleashed a brutal strike without warning. The first blow landed, and the room fell silent in shocked disbelief. The wounded man begged, while jeers and threats answered his pleas relentlessly. Yu Bayam stood at the edge, watching how the guest enforced dominance through violence. The club guest stepped forward and measured the wounded man with a cold gaze. He spoke a score aloud and compared the hit to a 100-point benchmark. The wounded man pleaded, while the crowd jeered and filmed the scene. The guest taunted the victim and raised his fist again without warning. His follow-up strike landed hard and sent the target reeling across the floor. Laughter and stunned silence mixed as the room absorbed the renewed assault. Yu Bayam had stood aside as the club guest measured the wounded man with cold cruelty. The crowd tallied points and jeered, while phones loudly recorded every strike. The newcomer absorbed blow after blow without faltering and left onlookers mocking and stunned. A red-haired smoker watched from the edge and vowed to train that kid. The injured man wheezed and spat out broken words between deep gasps. A quiet voice asked if he was finished, and the room held its breath. Yu Bayam had stood aside as the club guest measured the wounded man with cold cruelty, and the crowd recorded every strike. The newcomer absorbed blow after blow and left onlookers mocking and stunned. A red-haired smoker vowed to train the kid while the injured man struggled for words. The atmosphere shifted as men moved to business and demanded publication of a crypto coin. Voices spiked and a man with a gold chain exploded in profanity, refusing to cooperate. The suited figure remained still, and others turned to ask Mr. Steve what he would do next. Yu Bayam had stood aside while the club guest measured the wounded man, and the crowd recorded every strike. The newcomer had absorbed blows and left onlookers mocking and stunned. In the same room, a man with a gold chain insisted they not let it slide. The red-haired smirker dismissed the concern and told his men to do whatever was necessary. A subordinate in a suit closed and locked the door on command, which provoked shouted demands from onlookers to open it. Voices rose and the room's mood turned colder as plans for publication were forced forward. Yu Bayam had remained aside as the club guest measured the wounded man and the onlookers recorded strikes. A man with a gold chain had insisted the matter not be left unresolved. The red-haired smoker dismissed concern and ordered his men to act. A subordinate in a suit had closed the door on command, provoking shouts. In the panel, a black-suited assailant struck the wounded man hard in the face. Impact lines and sound effects drove the violence home as he fell. Onlookers reacted with mockery, and a sharp scream cut through the room. Yu Bayam stood to the side while the club guest measured the wounded man and onlookers recorded each strike. Tension snapped when the wounded man began pleading, offering money and begging for mercy. The black-suited assailant seized the moment and delivered a brutal blow that sent the wounded man sprawling across the floor. The victim lay dazed and then fumbled to rise, confused. The attacker barreled forward and struck again, driving the man flat and silencing his pleas. Onlookers watched, some mocking, as the room filled with the sounds of impact and panting breath. Yu Bayam had stood aside as the club guest and onlookers closed in on the wounded man. The victim scrambled across the floor and shouted that he was the vice president of Bitmain, threatening to tell his father. The club guest answered with another brutal strike and forced him down. Pleas faltered beneath mocking laughter from the crowd laughers and the watching crowd. The club guest taunted the man about hustling his way to vice president at 25, while the wounded man lay gasping and stunned under the weight of the room's contempt. Yu Bayam had stepped back while the club guest and onlookers closed around the wounded man. The victim scrambled and begged, insisting he would never tell his father. The club guest dismissed the plea and told him to hustle his way out again. When the victim pleaded for mercy, the club guest answered with a single blunt word. He struck the man down without hesitation. The blow landed hard and the victim screamed as he collapsed to the floor. Laughter and murmurs rolled through the room and no one intervened. The crowd's contempt left the wounded man broken and exposed. Earlier, the wounded man had been struck and left broken amid laughter and contempt. The next day, he ran to the family gate and knelt, crying for his father. He blamed a woman for the attack and begged for help and mercy. The older man only snapped at him to shut up and not interrupt. Inside the room, men kept playing mahjong, refusing to pause their game. Players argued about a trashed card until one shouted "Ron" and the table erupted. Earlier, the wounded man had been struck and left broken as others laughed and turned away. The next day, he ran to the family gate and knelt, begging his father for help, while the older man ordered him silent. Inside the room, the mahjong players refused to stop their game. During a charged hand, a player screamed as his fingers were crushed. The table fell silent, then erupted when Mr. Kim's discarded tile produced a Ron for Baek-hoon. Men applauded and called him the greatest while Baek-hoon waved off their praise. Earlier, the injured man had begged, while the mahjong game erupted around Baek-hoon's winning discard. Baek-wi stood with a drawn sword and demanded to know who made him like that. His posture dominated the frame, and he was labeled CEO of Bitmain and White Monster. A wide shot showed the Bitmain building's facade and underscored the company's corporate reach. An unnamed executive crossed her arms and shouted at the men angrily. She demanded to know who had beaten Bitmain's vice president and warned of consequences. Two suited men stood silent and avoided eye contact under her rebuke. The corridor hummed with threat as alliances and violent reckoning loomed ahead. Voices rose in the corridor as a junior mocked Kim Myung and pushed the conversation toward violence. He asked if he could beat the man now. Another man barked an insult and blamed Team 1. The mood turned sharp and watchful. One of the leaders then announced plainly that one of the three team leaders was a spy. The accusation named Team Two's leader Kim Myung. She folded her arms and weighed the possibility. She recalled having interrogated someone and replayed that exchange. When pressed with a direct question, she denied being the spy. Voices in the corridor hardened when leaders accused a team leader of spying. They singled out Kim Myung. She paused and considered how an old interrogation made her suspect. The atmosphere stayed sharp and watchful. Lee Jimin then stepped forward and cleared his throat. He offered a tentative greeting and asked about Malatang restaurants. Team 3 members snapped at him and told him to read the room. He apologized and said he thought they were fighting. Someone confirmed his title as Team 3 leader Lee Jimin. His research had yielded almost nothing about the legendary one. He could not confirm the figure's gender or habits. With scant evidence, leaders had labeled the one the prime spy suspect. The crypto coin department was summoned, and members gathered at the corridor outside the restroom. A voice identified as Chairman Jung instructed them to assemble. The protagonist recognized the voice and froze. He wondered if the command meant they had been watched. Tension tightened the group, and eyes scanned the hallway for unseen observers. Chairman Jung's voice had ordered them to assemble, and the group obeyed. A man sat behind the table and announced an urgent matter. He relayed that Baekgui, the CEO of Bitmain, demanded surrender of the suspect who assaulted the vice chairman. Murmurs spread through the gathered onlookers and suits. The protagonist froze and watched the accusation land. The speaker named Baek-hoon and linked his family to Bitmain's founding. He added that the family's past traced to an infamous gang. The corridor tightened with suspicion and fear as eyes searched for oversight. After Chairman Jung's accusation, the room listened as speakers described the CEO's youth. They said Baekgui had once competed with international mafias and earned the nickname White Monster. The speakers warned that when Baekgui demanded a man, it meant torture and likely death. They named his collection of medieval devices and implied a hooded chamber ready for execution. They claimed 9 out of 10 victims did not survive his methods. One man stated that refusing Baekgui's demands would mean war. The assembly fell silent and the mood turned cold. They gathered around the marble table as a voice demanded who had done it. A man in a dark shirt opened his mouth to answer the accusation directly. A pink-haired man stepped forward and loudly claimed he had beaten the target. He added that the vice president had provoked him and he had retaliated. An involuntary exclamation swept the room and tension tightened around the table. Yu Baeum tried to speak to claim responsibility, but another man cut him off. The man ordered Yu Baeum to shut up and the meeting fell mute. The meeting had ended in strained silence around the marble table. A pink-haired man stepped forward and scolded newcomers. He said a newbie should not get involved. He ordered them to listen while their rank remained low. The protagonist remained silent and watched. Voices whispered about leader Steve. Steve stood with his back turned and clenched his fist. An older man asked if he could handle Baekgui's. Steve replied he could endure torture. The group braced as the order settled. The meeting closed with stiff silence, and the protagonist watched from the edge of the table. A man in a black suit said the situation would worsen if he did not go, and then declared he did not care. He expected Stephen's interruption would not change the outcome. The pink-haired man stepped forward and rejected a direct trip to Baekgui. He said there was another way and announced he had a plan. Faces around the room tightened, and several leaders registered alarm as the proposal landed. The meeting closed with stiff silence while the protagonist watched from the table's edge. A man in a black suit warned that the situation would worsen and said he did not care. Stephen's interruption failed to shift the mood. The pink-haired man refused a direct trip to Baekgui and promised an alternate way. Faces tightened as leaders absorbed the proposal. Then a single figure stepped forward and spoke plainly. He declared their aim to destroy Baekgui the White Monster. The room registered the statement, and the plan's stakes became immediate. The protagonist stood and announced that he had a plan to destroy Baekgui the White Monster. His declaration cut through the meeting and drew immediate disbelief. Several leaders asked how they could possibly destroy Beekwe and demanded specifics. He said he would explain in time, but first needed a formal permission to act. The room's atmosphere shifted from fatigue to alertness as people registered the claim. Murmurs and sharp questions rose while the group weighed the risk and the authority his request implied. Chairman Jung listened from his chair as the room waited. Kim Myung stepped forward and asked for the job, saying she would lead 3 people and solve the issue. 2 men reacted with shock and disbelief at taking orders from a newcomer. The room questioned the wisdom of the move, while previous claims about destroying Beekwe still echoed. The protagonist then stood and asked if anyone had better plans. The question tightened the air and forced the group to weigh action against risk before committing authority. Chairman Jung rose from the chair and halted the rising argument in the room.